Hollow Street is a place of endless night, shrouded in fog that never lifts and guarded by lanterns that never die. For generations, its cursed glow has trapped families within their homes after sunset, erasing anyone who dares step outside. Eleanor Morland has lived with the whispers and vanishes, but when the lantern at her own door begins to falter, she knows the curse is shifting. With her son Thomas at her side and haunted by the memory of her vanished husband, Eleanor must confront the shadows and the lantern wraith that lurks within the mist before the last light fades. Hollow Street had always been shrouded in mist, a persistent fog that clung to the cobblestones like a living thing. Tonight, as every night, it crept along the narrow Victorian lane with a slow, deliberate grace, swallowing the gas lamps and muffling the distant echoes of a city that felt far away. The street lanterns burned with an unwavering light, their flames steady and eternal, as if defying time itself. The orange glow bled through the murk, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like the fingers of forgotten ghosts. At the threshold of number 14, Eleanor Morland stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the lantern that hung by the front door. Her tall frame was silhouetted against the amber light spilling from the windows behind her. The chill of the fog seeped through her thin shawl, but she barely noticed. Her attention was consumed by the faintest irregularity in the lantern's flame. For years, the lantern had burned with perfect consistency, a constant comfort in a world where leaving the house after sunset meant vanishing without trace. But now, as she watched, a subtle flicker disturbed the steady glow. It was almost imperceptible, a brief, shuddering pulse, yet it sent a ripple of unease through her chest. Eleanor's sharp eyes narrowed. She raised a hand, as if to steady the flame, but the glass was cold beneath her fingers. The dimming was not a trick of the light or a gust of wind. It was something else, something wrong. It whispered of change in the endless night that cloaked Hollow Street. Behind her, the house was quiet. Thomas, her teenage son, had retired early, restless and uneasy about the strange whispers that drifted like smoke through the neighborhood. Eleanor listened for the familiar creaks and sighs of the old Victorian home, the comforting sounds that tethered her to reality. But tonight, even the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The legend of Hollow Street was as old as the lanterns themselves. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the curse, a dark enchantment that bound the residents to their homes after dusk, trapping their souls in an eternal twilight. Those who dared to step outside were swallowed by the fog, erased from existence. Eleanor had grown up with the stories, skeptical yet unable to deny the truth etched in the absence of the vanished. The street beyond the moorland doorstep was a tableau of eerie stillness. Houses stood with windows shuttered tight, their occupants locked away in fearful compliance. The lanterns, like sentinels, marked the boundary between safety and oblivion. Eleanor's gaze traveled along the fog-draped street, past the faint outlines of neighbors' homes where shadows flickered behind curtains. Some windows glowed softly, others were darkened, silent witnesses to lives held hostage by the curse. Her thoughts drifted to the neighbors who had disappeared over the years, families who had once laughed and lived behind those walls, now reduced to whispers and empty doorsteps. The weight of their absence pressed on her like the fog itself. From somewhere nearby, a faint murmur rose, the low, nervous voices of those still trapped. Eleanor recognized the trembling tones of Martha Griggs, her elderly neighbor, who paced behind her shuttered window with hands clenched tightly around a threadbare shawl. Eleanor had heard the stories Martha told, stories of flickering lights and ghostly figures drifting just beyond the lantern's glow. Fear was a tangible presence in Hollow Street, as real as the fog, as binding as the curse. Suddenly, Eleanor's attention snapped back to her own lantern. The flicker returned, more pronounced this time, casting grotesque shadows that danced against the brick walls. The familiar objects in her hallway twisted into sinister shapes. A coat rack morphed into a clawed hand. A portrait frame seemed to leer with hollow eyes. She swallowed a rising tide of panic but forced herself to breathe steadily. The lantern was dying. She took a step inside, closing the door against the creeping chill. The lamp's glass shimmered faintly in the dim light. A fragile barrier between the darkness and the fragile sanctuary Eleanor had built for her family. She thought of Jacob, her husband, vanished on a night much like this, swallowed by the fog after stepping beyond their doorstep. The memory was a knife edge, sharp, painful, unresolved. Eleanor moved to the mantel and retrieved a small, worn journal from a stack of books. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing pages filled with careful notes and sketches, observations of the lantern's steady light, records of strange sounds, and the faint outlines of shadows she couldn't explain. Tonight, she would add the flickering flame, the first sign that the curse's grip was loosening or tightening. Outside, the night deepened. The fog thickened and curled like living fingers around the street lamps. Eleanor's breath formed a pale mist as she exhaled, her heart pounding with the weight of what was to come. The ever-burning lanterns promised safety, but the moorland lantern's faltering light was a harbinger of doom. She glanced toward Thomas's room, a faint glow beneath the door hinting at the restless boy's wakefulness. The curse was no longer an abstract terror. It was a threat closing in on her family. Eleanor steeled herself. Whatever lay beyond the flicker, she would face it. For Thomas, for herself, for the memory of Jacob. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating, and the lantern flickered again, a dying heartbeat in the heart of Hollow Street. But tonight, Eleanor Morland would not turn away. The fog had thickened since morning, a dense, clammy blanket that clung to Hollow Street with a suffocating insistence. Eleanor Morland stood at the threshold of her doorway, eyes narrowing into the swirling grey veil that blurred the gas lamp's unwavering golden glow. The lanterns, eternal sentinels of this cursed street, cast their light through the mist, never flickering, never dying except, as Eleanor had begun to dread, her own lantern at the moorland home. There, she had noticed a faint, almost imperceptible falter in its steady flame, like the stuttering breath of something struggling to survive. Her gaze drifted uneasily to the shadows dancing at the edges of the fog. Shapes flitted just beyond the reach of the lanterns, light blurred, shifting silhouettes that vanished when she blinked or turned her head. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional soft murmur of the wind curling through the narrow street and the distant clatter of shutters being hastily closed. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine, though the air was not cold. It was the kind of chill born from the unseen and uncertain. Inside the dim parlor, Thomas Morland sat hunched over the family's lantern, his hands deft but shaking as he adjusted the wick and fussed over the glass casing. His tousled brown hair fell into his eyes as he leaned closer, lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. He had become obsessed with the lantern's well-being, as if repairing its faltering flame could stave off the creeping dread that had begun to grip their home. Eleanor watched him quietly, her heart tightening with a mixture of pride and helplessness. "Mother," Thomas whispered suddenly, not looking up, "do you think it's possible to fix it? To make the light strong again?" Eleanor hesitated before answering, her voice low but steady. "I don't know, Thomas, but we have to try." Outside, the street had grown quieter still. The neighbors, their faces drawn and pale, hurried to close their windows and bolt their doors well before dusk. Eleanor's ears caught the faintest hint of sobbing carried on the wind, a sound that sent a shudder through her. It came from the Griggs household next door, where Martha Griggs, an elderly woman always wrapped in a shawl, had been seen trembling as she watched the sunset from behind shuttered windows. News had spread like wildfire through Hollow Street. Another family had vanished after dark, leaving behind an empty house swallowed by the ever-thickening fog. The neighbors whispered of the curse in hushed tones, clutching talismans and muttering prayers, but none dared to venture beyond their thresholds after nightfall. Eleanor's skepticism, long-standing despite the stories, began to waver under the weight of these losses. That evening, Eleanor found herself drawn to the window, staring into the creeping gloom. The lanterns cast long, distorted shadows that flickered and twisted as if alive. The strange shapes in the fog seemed to grow bolder, their presence a dark pulse just beyond the edge of vision. The air felt charged, as if the night itself was holding its breath. "Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, turning from the window. "We must prepare. Whatever is out there, it's getting closer." He nodded, determination flashing in his serious eyes. "I'll keep working on the lantern. It's the only thing keeping us safe." Eleanor moved to light the candles around the room, their small flames flickering in defiance of the encroaching darkness. She retrieved her journal and began to document the events unfolding around her. The flickers in the lantern's light, the shifting shadows in the fog, the growing silence and fear that gripped Hollow Street. As the night deepened, the weight of the curse pressed heavier on her chest. She could no longer ignore the signs. The legends might have been whispered warnings, but now they were a living nightmare creeping through the mist. The question that haunted her was no longer if the lantern's light would fail, but what darkness would be unleashed when it finally did. Outside, unseen eyes watched from the fog, waiting for the light to falter, for the shadows to claim their prey. And in the silence, Eleanor made a silent vow she would uncover the truth behind the curse, no matter the cost. For her family, for the lost, and for the street that had become both prison and battleground. The night was far from over, and the shadows among the fog were only beginning to stir. The persistent fog that smothered Hollow Street seemed to press itself against Eleanor Morland's thin window pane, each droplet of moisture a muted echo of the secrets the street held. She sat hunched over her journal, the dim light of the family's stubborn lantern casting long, trembling shadows across the cramped room. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. Outside, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sigh of the fog as it slithered between the gas lamps, which burned with an unnatural steadiness. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, describing the whispering voices she'd caught at the edges of hearing over the past few nights. A low susurrating murmur that seemed woven into the very fabric of the fog, slipping through the cracks of her shuttered window and curling around her like a living thing. She paused, her sharp eyes lifting to the dark glass, straining to pierce the gloom. For a moment, a flicker of movement caught her attention, a shadow darting just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving her breath hitching in her chest. The journal was an act of defiance, as much as documentation, a way to keep the encroaching darkness at bay, to impose order on the creeping chaos. Eleanor's thoughts kept returning to Agnes Crowley, the reclusive woman who had lived at the far end of Hollow Street for as long as anyone could remember. Rumored to be touched by strange knowledge, Agnes was both feared and disregarded by the neighbors, wrapped in layers of whispered stories and suspicion. But Eleanor knew she had to seek her out. If the curse was real, If the lanterns truly held the street captive in this endless night, then Agnes might hold the key to understanding. Bundling herself against the chill, Eleanor stepped out into the fog-choked street. The gas lamps cast halos of golden light, their steady flames impervious to the damp air. But the fog swallowed the street's edges, turning familiar houses into ghostly silhouettes. Her footsteps were muffled, swallowed by the thick carpet of mist that clung to the cobblestones. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of a shutter or the distant bark of a dog. She reached Agnes's cottage, a crooked, weather-beaten structure half hidden behind overgrown hedges. The windows glowed faintly, promising warmth and answers. Eleanor hesitated before knocking, the sound sharp and urgent in the stillness. The door creaked open almost immediately, revealing the small, cluttered interior lit by an assortment of candles and lanterns of every shape and size. Agnes Crowley stood framed in the doorway, a slender figure draped in layers of dark, worn fabric. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes sharp and piercing seemed to look right through Eleanor, weighing her very soul. Without a word, she motioned Eleanor inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of herbs, old paper, and something faintly acrid smoke from a smouldering incense, perhaps, or something less natural. Shelves bowed under the weight of dusty tomes, jars filled with strange roots and powders, and odd artifacts that seemed to hum with a silent power. Agnes gestured to a worn chair near a small fire, and Eleanor seated herself, feeling the weight of the room's secrets pressing down upon her. Agnes spoke in riddles at first, her voice a low murmur blending with the crackling fire. She spoke of the lanterns, their cursed light, and the shadowy entity bound to them, the lantern wraith. Her words painted a picture of a ritual gone wrong centuries ago, when the townsfolk had tried to imprison a malevolent force, only to bind it to the very light meant to protect them. The curse was both jailer and guardian, a cruel tether holding the street in perpetual twilight. Eleanor listened, each revelation a hammer blow to her skepticism. The whispers she'd heard, the shadows that flickered at the edge of sight, they were not figments of exhaustion or imagination, but manifestations of a darkness clawing to break free. Agnes's eyes glinted with a mixture of sorrow and warning as she produced a brittle, folded note, scrawled with symbols Eleanor barely understood. "This," Agnes said, pressing the paper into Eleanor's hand, "is what remains of the ritual's record. It holds clues to the curse's undoing, but beware, the price of knowledge is steep." A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine as the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. She folded the note carefully, tucking it into her coat. The journey back home was a blur of swirling mist and half-heard voices. The whispers had grown louder now, no longer teasing at the edges of sound, but pressing close, urgent and insistent. Back in the sanctuary of her parlor, Eleanor locked the door and lit every candle she could find, the flickering flames casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. She opened her journal once more, the pen moving with renewed purpose as she transcribed Agnes's riddles and the fragmented history of Hollow Street's curse. Her mind raced with questions and possibilities, the weight of her discoveries settling like stones in her chest. Outside, the fog thickened still, swallowing the street in silence and shadow. The lanterns burned on, their light steady but cold, an eternal prison. Eleanor's resolve hardened. She would not let her family vanish into that endless night. Whatever the cost, she would uncover the truth beneath the whispers in Hollow Street. As the candlelight flickered and the night stretched on, Eleanor's eyes caught movement once again, a fleeting shadow at the window, watching, waiting. The game had begun, and the darkness was eager to claim its due. The dim light of the moorland lantern flickered once more, a hesitant pulse that seemed to shudder against the thickening dusk. Eleanor stood by the hearth, her sharp eyes fixed on the wavering glow that had always been their beacon in the endless night of Hollow Street. Tonight, though, the familiar steady flame betrayed her, faltering, uncertain, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and stretched across the cracked walls like sinister phantoms. The room, usually a refuge from the chill fog that clung to the street outside, now felt claustrophobic and alien, as if the very air carried a weight of unseen menace. Thomas sat nearby, shoulders hunched, his lean frame betraying a restless energy that no amount of quiet could quell. His tousled brown hair fell over his serious expression as he fidgeted with the lantern's brass fittings, attempting repairs by the flickering candlelight. "It's just a mechanism," he muttered, more to himself than to Eleanor. "I can fix this. It's all just old parts, nothing supernatural." Eleanor's gaze softened briefly, catching the familiar stubbornness in her son's eyes, but the unease in her chest deepened. She had seen the lantern's flames falter before, but never like this, never with such violent flickers that seemed to claw at the edges of the light, threatening to snuff it out entirely. Later, as Thomas continued his futile attempts to steady the lantern, Eleanor retreated to the small study Agnes Crowley had allowed her to access. The air was thick with the scent of damp paper and dust. The dim room, lit only by a single candle whose flame danced in tandem with the lantern's uncertain glow in the adjacent room. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the leather-bound tome Agnes had given her. Its ancient pages, brittle but filled with cryptic symbols and faded script. The words spoke of rituals long forgotten, of a time when Hollow Street was young and the lanterns were first lit not as mere sources of light, but as prisons, binding a dark force to the fog and shadows that perpetually blanketed the street. Her breath caught when she read the passage, detailing a failed ritual meant to imprison a malevolent entity, an errant force that became the Lantern Wraith, a guardian and jailer born of desperation and tragedy. The lanterns, it seemed, were both the curse and the key, their eternal light a prison that kept the street's inhabitants trapped in an unending twilight. A sudden creak from the floorboards startled Eleanor. She slipped the book shut and turned, her eyes meeting Thomas's. His face was pale, the earlier frustration replaced by a dawning fear. He had stopped his repairs and now watched the lantern with a mixture of hope and dread. "Mum," he whispered, "I don't think this is just a broken lantern anymore." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Neither do I, but now that I understand what we're facing, we can't let the darkness win. We have to fight it." Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes like a living thing, muffling the distant sounds of the street and swallowing the faint glow of neighboring lanterns. Eleanor felt the weight of the curse settle heavier in her bones, but within her, a flicker of resolve kindled a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the dim light could be restored. As she returned to the parlor, the lantern's flame flickered violently, a sudden gust from the fog outside threatening to extinguish it. Eleanor's hands steadied the lamp, her breath catching as the shadows recoiled. In that suspended moment between light and darkness, she vowed to unravel the curse's secrets, no matter the cost. The dim light faded again, but Eleanor's determination burned brighter than ever. The battle for Hollow Street had only just begun. The night outside whispered promises of dread and despair, but within the moorland home, a steely defiance took root, a fragile beacon in the encroaching gloom.